Welcome to Carroll Creates, a podcast series produced by Court Library at Carroll College. This podcast engages the Carroll community of faculty, students, staff, and alumni about something they have created and what that process was like for them. Our sixth episode features Dr. Bob Swartout, a former faculty member in Carroll's history department and the unofficial Carroll College historian. Dr. Swartout is the author of the book Bold Minds and Blessed Hands, the First Century of Montana's Carroll College. We'll hear about what went into creating this important work, and Dr. Swartout reveals pieces of Carroll's history that stood out to him in his research. This episode was produced by Elizabeth Carr and hosted by Heather Navratil. The episode's music track, Mr. Mason, was provided by Zapsplat. Please enjoy the following episode.
We're here with Dr. Robert Swartout this morning. He wrote several books, including one about Carroll College, Bold Minds and Blessed Hands, the First Century of Montana's Carroll College. Good morning, Bob.
Morning, Heather.
How did you decide to write a book about Carroll's history, and how did you start such a monumental project?
Well, I think there are a couple of factors that came into play there. Within the history department, one of our required courses was something called the Research Seminar in History. In fact, I had helped institute that when I came to Carroll in 1978. And that meant that all history majors at Carroll would be taking a course where they would be involved in writing history themselves. Not just a history report, maybe the sort of thing that they would have done in high school, but they were really creating history. They would embed themselves in primary as well as secondary sources. They would be making an original contribution to our understanding of history, whatever that topic might be. A lot of those topics were local history, Montana history or history of the Pacific Northwest, because the resources were available here. Well, several students, as it turned out, this wasn't planned, it just was sort of happenstance, but a number of students wound up doing papers on various aspects of Carroll's history. For example, back in the 1980s, we had a student by the name of Dave McGoldrick. Dave wrote his research seminar paper on the origins of Carroll College, the founding of Carroll College. That later became the basis for his master's thesis in history at the University of Montana. I had another student, Mariah Johnston, who wrote a wonderful research seminar paper on the impact of World War II, or the aftermath of World War II. A lot of people don't realize that a significant number of World War II veterans came to Carroll College. In fact, at that time, they were one of the largest segments within the overall student body. And students did other topics, and we maybe will mention some of those others this morning. But through the work that my students had done, I began to develop a richer appreciation for Carroll and for the history of Carroll. And I thought at one point, it might be neat if we could do a book that would try and tell that entire story as much as possible. So that was rolling around in my head as the years passed. And then it was probably about 5 or 6 years before the centennial would take place. And things kicked off in 2009 because we look at 1909 as the founding of Carroll. President Tom Trebon wanted to meet with the members of the history department to see if they had any ideas about producing a centennial history. And so I was there along with Father William Graytack, Bill Graytack, and Father Jeremiah Sullivan, my two colleagues for years and years. And I always deferred to Father Graytack. He was the one who hired me in 1978. He was then head of the history department. And then when Father Graytack went to Belgium for 5 years as rector for the American College in Louvain, Father Sullivan took over. And he really mentored me for my first 5 years that I was at Carroll. So I looked up to both men. They were just wonderful people. Tom Trebon said, well, if we did a centennial history, who might do that? And Father Graytack and Father Sullivan pointed at me and said, Bob will do it. So I felt like I had no choice. I was given my assignment. I said, okay, all right, I'll take that on. Again, it was in part because of research that my own students had done over the years that had really aroused my interest. And then, again, the two people that meant the most to me in the history department, Father Graytack and Father Sullivan, essentially said,
he'll do it.
Bob's going to do it. So that's how it came about.
Thank you. That's a good story. What was your research process like for this work?
So I had to figure out how I could tell that story. Well, and a couple of things. We talked about what sort of book we would produce, and I wanted it to be serious history. It wasn't going to just be filled with funny stories, that sort of thing. I didn't want it to be something that would simply praise Carroll, although I have tremendous affection for Carroll. I wanted it to be authentic history. We would tell the story as it happened. So how would I get my hands on that story, or how would I be able to flesh it out? There were 4 or 5 types of materials that were really important to the research that I was doing. Thanks to Christian Fraza, I was able to begin to explore Carroll's archival material, which were housed here at the Corrett Library. So there were college archival materials that weren't readily available to the public. Mm-hmm. Thanks to Sister Dolores Brinkle, who was then archivist for the Helena Diocese, I had access to diocesan archives. And those were especially important in the early history of Carroll College. So I made significant use of those. Another important resource was the prospector. Sometimes we don't appreciate just how important that college newspaper has been over the years. And the prospector has existed really from the very earliest days of Carroll right up to current times. So the prospector was just a treasure trove of information available to me. And then I also conducted a number of interviews, some with faculty members, some with past presidents. Monsignor Harrington, Joseph Harrington, who was president of Carroll in the early 70s, was a wonderful resource. Dr. Matt Quinn, who was president of Carroll from 1989 to 2000, was very honest and candid in his comments to me. So a number of personal interviews were conducted in order to fill in some of those gaps. And again, research that had been done by past Carroll students. They taught me all sorts of interesting things about Carroll. Yeah. I can touch on a couple of those once we get into the interview a little bit more. But again, I tried to cast my net as widely as possible, and I also tried to place the history of Carroll within the context of Montana history and within the context of the history of higher education, especially Catholic higher education.
And now the prospectors have all been digitized, and you can do a word search or a person search. So I bet when you were doing it, it was quite different. Can you just briefly touch on that?
So, and you're right, and I've recommended that to many people. If they have interest in Carroll, they can go to all of those newspapers online now. And the word search is an amazing thing. Amazing. When I was doing it, I went literally through every issue of the Prospector, page by page. And again, I discovered stories in there that were entirely new to me. You know, the fact that as early as the 1930s, Carroll was an integrated college. Didn't matter where students might have come from, if they were Catholic or non-Catholic, whatever their ethnicity or race was, they were still welcome to Carroll. That diversity of students would make a major impact on the institution over time. Mm-hmm. And all of that could be found in the Prospector. Mm-hmm. So it's a tremendous resource. Yeah. And another thing too, one of the harder things to tell, I think, in any college or university history is the life of the students, what it was like, because often histories of an institution will focus on administrations. They'll often define them by the presidency of a certain person or by certain faculty members who had taught for a long period of time. But I think the most important element of the story is the students, because without students, there is no college. They are the heart and soul of the institution. From generation to generation, decade to decade, how do you tell their story Well, again, something like the prospector helps to reveal sort of that inner voice that often is overlooked.
Describe how you overcame one major challenge during the entire creation and publication process.
Well, I was curious in terms of how the money became available to establish the school in the first place. And I knew from reading some of the college archives and some of the early bulletins or catalogs of the school that Bishop John Patrick Carroll, he's not only the namesake for the school, but he was the driving force behind it. And that was in part because he came from an educational background himself. He'd been president of a Catholic college in Duquesne, Iowa, before being named the bishop of the Helena diocese. So when he arrived here, he was determined to create a diocesan college. How was he going to get the money to do that sort of thing? I knew that he had approached certain people in the community who had a commitment to Catholic education. Thomas Cruz, who had made his fortune from gold and silver mining, was one of those. He provided a good deal of the funds for the building of the cathedral. Some of that money also made its way to Carroll. But there were sort of mysteries surrounding that. Where did the money come from? How was it funded? That's where the diocesan archives really were critical. And again, it was Sister Dolores who made those available to me, allowed me to get into certain diocesan records that finally made it possible to sort of connect the dots to tell that story more fully.
What are the biggest moments in Carroll's history for you, if you could break them down on one hand?
Well, I'll say a little bit about how I organized the book. I decided that there would be 5 major chapters. Each one would cover roughly a generation, or in other words, about a 20-year period. The history of Carroll up to that time was 100 years old, so divide by 5, that's 20. And as it turns out, there were major developments in the school's history during each 20-year period. For example, the first 20 years really dealt with the founding of the school. How was it created? Who were the driving forces behind that creation? And how did it get established? The next 20 years, say from 1930 to 1950, then focused on the challenges posed by the Great Depression and then World War II. The next chapter, the next 20 years from 1950 to 1970, dealt with the post-war boom. How did that post-war boom affect America as a whole? How did it affect higher education? How did that affect Carroll College? And then by the time you get toward the end of that 20-year period, you have the arrival of the first element of the baby boomers, young people who were born in, say, 1946, 47. They begin college in the late 60s. What impact would they have on Carroll? So in terms of the organization, I broke it up into those 5 chapters, each one about 20 years, and focused in on what I saw as sort of the driving themes for each period. I think one mistake that some college histories make is that they try to be so encyclopedic that you can't see the forest for the trees. Mm-hmm. Lots of wonderful vignettes in the story, but it's more difficult to figure out how this institution evolved over time. What are its key characteristics over time? And I wanted to identify those for Carroll College. And so each chapter is broken up into roughly 5 or 6 subunits that emphasize those particular themes. I don't know if you would call these turning points, but I think it's relevant to the situation Carroll faces today. Virtually every school in the United States, whether it's an elementary school or it's a research university, is coming to grips with the coronavirus and how they will deal with this crisis, how they will weather the storm. I think in the case of Carroll, it's helpful to place that within the larger historical context. For example, Carroll could have easily disappeared as a result of the Great Depression. You know, we sometimes forget about how horrific that was. Mm-hmm. That in the early 1930s, you know, today we have an unemployment rate of perhaps 10 or 11%. In the early 1930s, America had an unemployment rate of 25%, with almost no safety net whatsoever to help those people deal with that crisis. Another 25% were underemployed. Technically, they had some work, but either their hours or their wages, and often both, were drastically cut during much of the Great Depression. And Montana was especially hard hit by the Great Depression, but it faced really, really difficult circumstances. And Carroll was all part of that. Enrollment fell dramatically. In the late 1920s, during the first decade or two of Carroll's existence, it had roughly 250 students. Now, today that sounds like a very small number, but again, in the 1920s, that was an indication that this school was doing fairly well as a private Catholic institution. During the 30s, Carroll would never reach that number again. Enrollment would vary between roughly 80, for the entire college, 80 students to 140 students or so. And yet it was able to make it through those difficult times because the students and the faculty and the administration staff all pulled together to make sure that the school would not close. And then came World War II. At that point in time, Carroll was an all-male institution, and those young males, 18 to 22, were prime candidates for military service. Large numbers of Carroll students volunteered for military service. Others were drafted. Again, the school could have easily closed its doors at that time. In fact, the number of sort of regular full-time students by 1943-44 was no more than a dozen. So how does a college survive with a handful of students? Well, it survived in part because of something called the V12 program.
And one of your students wrote a thesis?
June Hagen, a phenomenal student, wonderful person, wrote her senior honors thesis on the V12 program. And for people who are unfamiliar with that, that was essentially a training program for naval officers. And Carroll was one of a handful of schools that were selected across the country for the V12 program. So almost overnight, Carroll was flooded, not with dozens, but hundreds of young men being trained for military service. Why was Carroll selected? It was in part because of President Riley, Father Emmett Riley, who reached out to a broader community to see if Carroll could be one of these training centers. He connected with a young congressman from Montana, first elected in 1942, Irish Catholic by the name of Mike Mansfield, perhaps the greatest politician in the history of Montana. Congressman Mansfield downplayed his own role in this, but I've seen the private letters and know that, in fact, his role was more significant than what he wanted to claim. But at any rate, because of the leadership of Monsignor Riley, because of the role of Mike Mansfield, Carroll was selected as a training site for the V12 program. I'm convinced that had that program not come to Carroll, Carroll would have probably been forced to close its doors. But it weathered the storm. These young men who were in the V12 program had a tremendous appreciation for Carroll. Years later, they would often come back to visit the school. Some made major financial donations to the school. A relationship was established that no one could have expected in, say, 1941 or 42. So Carroll was able to deal with the crisis of World War II and come out stronger, better than ever. Another example, 1935. We forget about the terrible earthquake that hit Helena in 1935. Carroll's campus was significantly damaged. There was another college in Helena at that time, Intermountain Union College. Its campus was so badly damaged that they had to close their doors, never to reopen. They eventually moved the school briefly to Great Falls and finally moved what was there in Great Falls over to Billings. And that institution then joined with Billings Polytechnic to create what is today Rocky Mountain College. But it began as Intermountain Union College. The earthquake removed it from the Helena scene. Carroll survived that situation. And thinking of another catastrophe, a physical one, we sometimes forget about the train explosion of 1989. Sure. But it did terrific damage to the campus. It was a miracle in many ways that we didn't have any significant injuries or casualties in the midst of that, mostly because the blast occurred so early in the morning, people were not out walking across the campus at that time. But it, too, could have adversely affected the school to such a degree that its future would have been problematic. But in fact, Carroll pulled together, came back stronger than ever, and in fact, out of that crisis, Matt Quinn led Carroll in the early and mid-1990s into a new generation, into a new era in the school's history. So it's not as though everything has always been easy for Carroll College. It has faced challenges that could have done in the school at any time. But the commitment that people had to the community, this sense of service that people had, both within the school and in the broader community, allowed Carroll to survive those difficult times and then come back, as I said, stronger than ever. And that's what my hope is for Carroll as it deals with this current crisis. And at some point, it will come to an end, and Carroll will be there to reach out and be even better than it was before. That's my feeling on it.
Thank you. What was one thing you learned about Carroll's history that really surprised you?
Oh, that's a good question. This wasn't a story that was completely new to me. I had heard bits and pieces of it, but I didn't hear all the details until I had a chance to really immerse myself in the archival materials we had available. It had to do with a football team at Carroll College in 1931. Have you heard about this, Heather, by chance? Well, in fact, it was still Mount St. Charles College because they didn't change the name until the next year, 1932. And my first exposure to this topic actually came from one of my students who wrote his research seminar paper on the topic. That's Paul Petrino, who is currently the head coach of the football program at the University of Idaho. Paul had played football at Carroll, had been a quarterback at Carroll, and was a history major. And he had heard through his family about this team in 1931. Now, we often celebrate the teams that had great success under Coach Mike Van Diest, rightly so. Many of those players on Mike's teams were students of mine. Many were history majors, as a matter of fact. 6 national championships in a decade, pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. But I would tease Mike and say, well, your players are doing pretty well, but I don't know if they could yet match the team of 1931. And Mike would grin. What was it about that team? Well, it was undefeated, so that's pretty amazing. It was unscored upon. So the teams playing against Carroll that year did not score a single point, which had to be the greatest defensive battle that Carroll was ever engaged in. Unscored upon for the entire season. So undefeated, unscored upon. And 2 of the teams it beat in that year were the University of Montana and Montana State University. And of course, I have many of my students who've gone to those schools for graduate work. I have friends on the faculty at both, and I always love to tell them this story, the 1931 Mount St. Charles football team.
Yeah, that's a good surprise.
Yeah.
What are a few things that didn't make it into the book that really interested you?
Well, I think they may have made it into the book because of space limitations. I couldn't always tell that story as fully as I would have liked to. One would be the role of the nursing department in Carroll's history. Like most Catholic institutions, male and female students were not. It was not a coeducational institution for its first 30 years or so. It was really the nursing program that integrated Carroll, that made it coeducational. That really grew out of World War II and the need for more nurses in the United States. But the decision was made in 1945-46 to admit the first female students to Carroll as nursing students. They began in the fall of 1946. And life wasn't always easy for these first women students at Carroll. There were male students who felt that this was their territory. It wasn't supposed to be coeducational, and even certain faculty who would not always make these women students feel welcome. But those first students did so well that by the early 50s, then just about all majors were opened up to women. So it was really those nursing majors and the success that they had achieved that led Carroll to sort of rethink its approach or its attitude toward coeducation. And at the time that Carroll became coeducational, 85% of Catholic colleges in America, colleges and universities in America, were not coeducational. So in that sense, Carroll was sort of in the forefront of rethinking coeducation in Catholic higher institutions. The students, those women students who came to Carroll in the 50s, were not able to live on campus. There were 3 dwellings, Immaculata Hall, Siena Hall, Dean Hall. Off campus, 2 of them were in what we today call the Mansion District, who again did so well academically, who meant so much to the school, that the school had to rethink its position on coeducation, so much so that then in 1959-60, the decision was made to build a large dormitory, a women's dormitory on campus. And of course, that was Guadalupe Hall. And the person really behind that was Archbishop Hunthausen when he was president of Carroll College. So Guadalupe was the first all-women's dorm built on campus. And again, that wouldn't have happened had it not been for the early success of those nursing students who came to Carroll in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Now, since I retired in 2014, I haven't been tracking honors theses in history, but I would say if no one has yet written an honors thesis on the history of the nursing program, and I know that students and professors in the program are aware of their own history, how that department has evolved over time, but I think it deserves a lengthy professional study to really tell that story in detail. We know today, of course, that the nursing program is one of the premier programs in the entire college. It's had a profound effect, not just on Carroll as an institution, but on the state of Montana, on America as a whole. You think of all of our nursing graduates in the last 20, 30, 40 years who have gone on to phenomenal careers. I think that's a story that needs to be told in greater detail. And I think sort of as a spin-off on that, I think the student's story needs to be told in greater detail. In a lot of ways, the heart and soul of any institution is really represented by the students because they have to have faith in the institution. You know, and this is true in 2020. It was true in 1920. Students have always had options. If they decided they wanted to go to college, there were hundreds, even thousands of schools they could choose from. If they were Montana kids, they certainly had lots of schools they could choose from within Montana. Why did they choose Carroll College? That's not an easy question to answer, right? It really depends on each student's story is unique in certain respects. But it sort of boils down to the fact that they had faith in Carroll. And I think this is especially true in the first 50, 60, 70 years of Carroll, before Carroll had established a kind of regional or national reputation. Why come to this particular school? It's because students believe that somehow this school would be of value to them, not just to get a job or establish a career, but it would be valuable to them for the rest of their lives. Non scholae sed vitae, right?
Right.
Not just for school, but for life. That was based on faith for every generation of students. In other words, the institution would not exist if those students did not have faith that this place would have a meaningful impact on their lives. That being the case, I think the future studies of Carroll should spend more time focusing on what it was like, what it is like to be a student at Carroll College. What are the benefits of that? What are the strengths? What are the challenges? What are the heartaches? I mean, sometimes those difficult things do arise. How has Carroll dealt with those kinds of issues? And as best I could, I tried to weave that student story into my history. But I think there's an awful lot more that still could be said about that. And in a sense, I talked about generations of being maybe every 20 years. And that's sometimes true for faculty and administration, but if you think of students, it's essentially a new generation of students every 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. And each generation faces its own challenges. Each generation sort of deals with those challenges in its own special way.
What is one thing you wish we had from Carroll's past that we don't? These could be records, artifacts.
I just got too busy with other things, so I wasn't able to do this myself. I should have. But I think it would be wonderful if we had an oral history project so that we could interview people on a regular basis. And I interviewed a number of people, staff, faculty, administrators, students, in doing my history, but it wasn't done in a sort of systematic fashion. I sometimes turned to certain people because they could shed light on a certain part of the story that I thought was important, and perhaps I didn't have other materials for that story. But I think a kind of systematic oral history project doesn't mean that every single student or every single person who works at Carroll has to be part of it, although that wouldn't be bad.
Yeah.
But a sampling of voices for each generation so that those would be preserved and would be available to future historians. You know, just as the prospector is a tremendous resource today for people who are investigating any part of Carroll's history. Mm-hmm. If we had a collection of oral histories, and now with technology, we could preserve those in a much more effective way than we could have 20, 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think that would be a wonderful addition to the materials we currently have.
Where can people access and buy your work?
Well, in terms of the Carroll history, I'm not sure how many volumes are still available, but probably the first place to check would be the Carroll bookstore to see if any there. If they don't, then I would encourage people to contact the alumni office. I believe that they probably still have some copies that are available. The latest project that I worked on was a book called Montana, a Cultural Medley. And it's really an anthology of Montana ethnic history. And much of its history, you know, we tend to think today that Montana is not as diverse as many other parts of the country. And in racial terms, that's certainly correct. But if we think in terms of not race but ethnicity, which I think is a more valuable term anyway, Montana is quite diverse. Mm-hmm. And in the past, it was one of the most diverse places in the country. In fact, it would go back, let's say use 1900 as a baseline. In 1900, Montana had the largest percentage of non-American-born residents within the state of any state west of the Mississippi other than one.
Wow.
Because immigrants were pouring into Montana from every part of the globe. Mm-hmm. Back in the 19th century, a significant percentage of Montanans came from China. At least 10% of all Montanans were Chinese in 1870. Think about that. Mm-hmm. In the 1880s, 1890s, huge numbers of Scandinavian immigrants from Central Europe poured into Montana. So Montana, historically speaking, was a very diverse place. My latest book focuses on that, Montana, a Cultural Medley. And it's available in bookstores here and there. I know that Leslie's Hallmark has had copies of it. I believe it has copies right now available. Mm-hmm. It was published by Far Country Press. So people who are interested in this new book can contact Far Country Press either by phone or email. I'm sure they could purchase copies from there.
Are you working on any new published works?
Well, right now I'm doing a couple of projects for the state of Montana. I can't go into the details of it now because it involves certain legal issues, but I'm exploring the history of rivers in Montana for the Montana Department of Justice.
Wow.
And a lot of the research for that has been done at the Montana Historical Society Research Center. And I've had a very close relationship with the Montana Historical Society for 40 plus years. When I first came to Carroll, 1978, I was introduced to folks there. Within 2 years, they had asked me to help them out with a project they were doing. And of course, literally dozens and dozens of my students have done research at the Montana Historical Society. Many have had jobs at the Montana Historical Society. Some are currently on the staff there. It's one of the great state historical societies found anywhere in the United States. So for me, it's a treat to go back there and not just visit with the staff, with the librarians that do these amazing things, but to be pouring through archival materials once again. Mm-hmm. I just get lost in that world.
Yeah.
It's just, wow, it's so exciting.
And will the shape of this new work be a book, articles?
Well, it's sort of a book-length piece, but it will be serving as a brief for the state of Montana.
Okay.
I'll just leave it.
Okay. What is one tip or takeaway you would give a student who's doing research?
I would say always keep an open mind. You know, we come to any topic with certain preconceived notions or biases. We all do, because that's what it means to be a human being. But all those years that I taught at Carroll, you know, I told students we weren't simply memorizing names and dates. I mean, I wanted students to know certain names and dates because that would give meaning to a story. But more than anything else, I thought of history as a kind of three-step process. You know, we don't memorize history, we do history. I like to think of it as an active verb. We do history. It's a three-step process. Step one is to gather the evidence, gather the materials. Step two is to then analyze or evaluate those materials, because some materials are going to be more important than others, so we have to weigh that evidence. Which evidence is most crucial to giving meaning to our story? And then the third step is to communicate our findings to a broader audience. And you might do that by writing papers, writing articles or books. It might be by giving talks, by doing interviews on radio or TV, whatever the case might be. But you haven't sort of completed that active verb until you've reached out to an audience to tell that story. Well, what if you find evidence that contradicts the assumptions you have about this topic, that challenges your preconceived notions of how the past unfolded? I think as historians we have an ethical responsibility not to ignore that evidence, but instead to rethink our analysis to change our own conclusions. We sort of owe that to our audience if we're going to be ethical and honest. So that would be my number one suggestion to students, to constantly challenge your own assumptions of the past. Not to automatically reject them, but to be willing to rethink them when you come across evidence that may say, oh, maybe the cause and effect here was not quite what I thought it was. Then you have to rethink the conclusions that you're drawing. And I've tried to do that through my career, probably not as successfully as I should have. But I think as historians, it's important for us to recognize that we have biases that are simply a part of our upbringing. You know, where we grew up, how we were raised, what we learned from our family, from our parents, our grandparents. It colors how we approach life. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that we reject that later on, but we have to challenge our assumptions if the evidence points in another direction. And I think that's the wonder of history, that we're always learning new things about it.
What's one good memory you have of Carrette Library?
Carroll sort of had this tradition, especially when Carrette first opened. Faculty members could come here to go through the stacks. You know, if they were doing a certain research project or trying to uncover the story of some event that took place, they were welcome to look through the stacks. And in those days, a lot of the books were downstairs. But classes were not held in the Carrette Library because it didn't have classrooms within it. But I had just created this new course, this research seminar in history, where my students would be active historians writing history of their own. Because of that, I felt they needed to be embedded in the library. I mean, you can't do that without a library. The library is the heart and soul of the educational experience. Lois Fitzpatrick was the new director of the library, and I approached Lois and said, Lois, we have this new class, the research seminar in history, and boy, it would be awfully nice if we could somehow meet in the library. And she said, well, This is being recorded, right, this interview? Well, she said, don't let the word get out, but for your class, we'll set aside this room. And is the room where the Board of Trustees had their regular meetings. So again, it was supposed to be just for the Board of Trustees, but history majors at Carroll College were allowed to have their class in that room because we were pouring over all these materials that were in the library. But because of that, I always felt that special connection.
Or she knew and you knew that history matters and research matters.
Yeah. Well, and you know, I couldn't have done the Carroll Centennial History without the tremendous support of the staff in the library. It couldn't have been done. Most of the Carroll materials that I used were housed in the library.
So we're winding it up here.
Okay.
Was there anything that you'd like to add that I didn't think to ask you?
A couple of little stories having to do with Carroll's history. You know,
Please.
think about some of the unsung heroes in Carroll's history. I mentioned how I think more focus might be placed on the life of a student at Carroll. Well, what was dorm life like over the years? That sort of thing. But clearly, one group of unsung heroines would be the Dominican sisters who worked at Carroll from 1925 until 1961. And there was a good senior honors thesis that was written on that experience, but it couldn't tell the whole story. And most people today are completely unaware of their contributions to Carroll. Mm-hmm. They were brought to Carroll by Bishop Carroll, John Patrick Carroll. It wasn't easy. Many of them came from Germany. It was not easy because of immigration laws in the United States in the mid-1920s, to get people out of Germany to the United States. But Bishop Carroll was able to work through the Catholic Church to bring the sisters here. And again, they were doing the dirty work, the grunt work. They were the ones who were cleaning the place from top to bottom, feeding the students, the staff. In those days, most of the faculty were priests. Again, without their contributions, Carroll wouldn't have survived. Mm-hmm. And yet, we often forget that story. So
yeah.
I think it's one that we need to remember. It's one that we need to celebrate. And they only left in 1961 when the Carroll campus was really being transformed. By then, Guadalupe Hall had opened, and in conjunction with that, what was called the Commons was then opened for the very first time. And with these new dorms in place, with this very large cafeteria now available to students, then a professional staff had to be brought in to deal with those things. Mm-hmm. But for, what was that, roughly 3.5 decades, the Dominican sisters kept Carroll alive as an institution.